In 1952, at an isolated Air Force outpost in Alaska, researchers began secret hypothermia experiments disguised as survival training. Prisoners recruited from federal facilities were flown in with promises of reduced sentences they would never receive. The cold vault was an underground steel room engineered to simulate Arctic storms with mechanical precision. Subjects were stripped to thin undershirts and locked inside as temperature gauges plunged below freezing. Researchers observed through a glass panel, noting the onset of confusion and slurred speech as core temperatures dropped. Some subjects tried to run in circles to stay warm, their limbs flailing in frantic stick figure desperation. Others collapsed early, their trembling diminishing into stillness as frost formed on their cartoon eyebrows. The cold caused muscle locking, leaving several frozen in crouched poses as though mid-scream. Researchers injected survivors with heated saline to test revival, causing agonizing spasms throughout their limbs. One subject revived long enough to ask why he was being punished, a question none of the staff acknowledged. Another regained consciousness only to convulse violently minutes later as internal organs failed from temperature shock. Technicians documented every stage, treating each collapse as merely another data point. Eventually, the vault floor became littered with frost-covered bodies awaiting transport to a hidden morgue. Guards lifted the bodies by limbs, sometimes snapping frozen joints with audible cartoon cracks. When an investigator visited unexpectedly, the facility claimed a training accident had occurred. Documents were burned in a furnace before the inspection reached the lower levels. The cold vault was sealed shut days later, its experiments erased from official history. But locals still whisper that strange metallic groans echo from beneath the snow during the coldest nights. Incident 2. The Sleep Chamber Trials, Virginia, 1964. In a government facility hidden within rural Virginia forests, researchers pursued a radical question. How long could the human mind survive without sleep? Volunteers were recruited under the guise of psychological studies, unaware of the extreme deprivation awaiting them. The sleep chamber was a padded white room with constant buzzing lights designed to overwhelm the senses. Subjects were monitored by overhead cameras that never blinked, even when the humans beneath them begged for darkness. After 24 hours, irritability set in. After 48, paranoia bloomed like a dark stain in their minds. Some began talking to invisible figures, waving their arms at blank walls as if defending themselves. One subject slammed his fists against the padding until his stick figure knuckles bent at strange angles. Another scratched symbols onto the padding with his nails, convinced they were messages from the Watcher. By day 4, hallucinations became indistinguishable from reality as subjects swatted at non-existent insects. Their bodies jerked involuntarily, muscles firing as the brain misinterpreted signals in its sleepless panic. Researchers sprayed cold mist whenever eyelids drooped, forcing consciousness back with cruel consistency. One subject collapsed from exhaustion but was revived with stimulant injections that sent his pulse racing uncontrollably. When he awoke screaming about faces behind the lights, staff recorded every word. Eventually, subjects slipped into microdreams, fragmented nightmares blending into reality. Some lashed out violently, convinced the researchers were monsters wearing human skins. After 9 days, the human body began shutting down, despite stimulants forcing consciousness artificially. The trials ended abruptly when a subject suffered cardiac arrest mid-sentence. The facility shut down, but locals still claim to see its interior lights flicker at night, with no one inside. Incident 3. The Radiology Basement, Illinois, 1957. In 1957, beneath the Chicago Teaching Hospital, a restricted basement lab conducted covert radiation exposure experiments on unwarned patients. Patients scheduled for routine checkups were quietly redirected into the lab without explanation. The room held a massive experimental X-ray emitter shielded only by thin curtains that did little to stop the radiation. Subjects were told to stand still for a moment, while the emitter activated with a deep metallic hum. The radiation burst was far stronger than medical standards, bathing their bodies in invisible lethal waves. Some subjects felt immediate burning sensations deep inside their bones. Others noticed metallic tastes and sudden nausea as their cells began collapsing microscopically. After repeated exposures, hair fell out in clumps, leaving stick figure heads covered in cartoon bald patches. Skin reddened into blistered patches, drawn as peeling cartoon layers sloughing from limbs. Researchers recorded each symptom as though cataloging plant growth rather than human suffering. One subject collapsed mid-session, his body jerking uncontrollably from nerve damage. Another attempted to flee, only to be dragged back by guards who treated him like a malfunctioning test object. The lab's lead scientist justified the cruelty as vital progress for military radiology applications. As symptoms worsened, victims were quietly discharged without explanation or follow-up care. Many developed tumors that bulged grotesquely, drawn as exaggerated cartoon lumps along their stick limbs. Families asked the hospital what happened, but administrators denied the basement had ever existed. Years later, the lab was sealed behind concrete walls, leaving its machines entombed like industrial fossils. But workers report hearing faint humming from behind the walls, as if the emitter still thrums to life in the dark. Incident 4. The Shock Ward Trials, California, 1961. In 1961, a psychiatric facility in Northern California began testing extreme electrotherapy on unwilling patients under the guise of emotion regulation research. Patients were selected not for illness severity but for lack of family connections who might ask questions. The shock ward was a sterile white room with a single metal chair bolted to the floor. Electrodes were attached to temples, chest, and even limbs to maximize neural mapping. When the generator activated, patients jerked violently, their stick limbs snapping upward like marionette strings. Researchers adjusted voltage in slow increments, documenting each distorted facial reaction. Some patients screamed until their voices degraded into hoarse static, drawn as jagged speech lines. Others bit their tongues, thin red lines dripping onto the white floor. Higher voltages caused muscles to seize so tightly that stick figure joints bent backward grotesquely. One patient remained conscious through every shock, glaring at the researchers with eyes filled with trembling hatred. Another sang nonsense frantically, believing the electricity was rearranging thoughts in his skull. When voltage peaked, blood vessels burst beneath the skin, illustrated as thick red fractures across limbs. The scientists congratulated themselves on productive episodes, ignoring the collapsed bodies before them. Patients who survived sessions were dragged back to their rooms, their limbs twitching uncontrollably for hours. Records show some subjects endured over 40 sessions, each more intense than the last. One subject died mid-shock, the electricity arching across his body like jagged bolts. Staff hushed the incident by falsifying reports, burying the truth beneath medical jargon. The shock ward was closed quietly, but old staff swear the generator still sputters on by itself at night. Incident 5, the Sensory Tank Program, Nevada, 1970. In 1970, an experimental Nevada facility began isolating human subjects in soundless, lightless sensory tanks for weeks at a time. Volunteers were misled, believing they'd spend only a few hours inside mild flotation chambers. Instead, they were sealed in narrow coffin-like tanks filled with body temperature water. Darkness was absolute, swallowing every trace of light until even blinking became indistinguishable. The silence was so complete subjects reported hearing their own heartbeat thudding like distant drums. Soon the mind began constructing false sounds, footsteps, whispers, sighs, that grew more real with each passing hour. Some subjects tried screaming, but the thick tank walls absorbed every sound into mute nothingness. Others clawed at the metal lid, their stick fingers scratching desperate marks into the surface. After days, hallucinations became vivid landscapes projected inside their mind's eye. Subjects saw faces in the darkness, faces that drifted closer no matter how tightly they shut their eyes. One subject believed the water had turned to hands pulling him downward. Another became convinced there was a second person in the tank breathing beside him. When researchers finally opened the lids, subjects recoiled as though emerging from years of isolation. Many couldn't walk, their limbs stiff from days of disuse, drawn as trembling sticks barely supporting them. Some refused to speak, communicating only with frantic gestures and paranoid glances. Others reported nightmares so vivid they couldn't distinguish waking life from dream shadows. The project was abruptly discontinued when a subject suffered catastrophic psychological collapse. The tanks were drained and stored away, but staff swear they still hear splashing inside them even when empty.